You know, one of the things that we've seen in our database now is that engagement is dropping among workplaces. And one of the reasons is that we are now living in a more asynchronous world, especially now that so many more people are working in a hybrid or working remotely. And that sort of asynchronous communication is causing us to write to each other. And that failure to understand each other is really a challenge. What would you say to people as someone who does excel in communication, especially in the written word? What do we need to do now as leaders in order to improve that so that we do understand each other through the written word?
So this is interesting. I tend to be rather terse. You wouldn't guess it from our conversation, but my email exchanges are very brief. I tend to boil things down to one or two sentences and sometimes just one or two words. And I'm sure some of my colleagues find that amusing. On the other hand, I have other colleagues whom, if I ask a question, I get back a dissertation.
Hmm.
I think brevity is important. Capturing the essence of something, is important because people won't remember, a 500-word essay, but they might remember a one sentence statement. So my view is that brevity is important. I am a heavy user of email, partly because I started using it when it was invented in 1971. And I found it useful partly because I'm hearing impaired. And so audio conversations have some risk factors associated with them if I didn't hear, the key word in a sentence. So written communication for me is important partly because of my hearing impairment. And so I've gravitated to jobs that involve the use of email. What I believe is that you can maintain relationships in written form, uh, but they need to be reinforced from time to time by face-to-face meetings. Even this one, which I'm thoroughly enjoying, isn't quite the same as sitting at the same table and enjoying a meal together, or getting up and having a big argument on the whiteboard. And so you need those reinforcing moments. But I think as long as they are there occasionally, you can maintain quite a good working relationship with written communication. I will say that the during this pandemic, where we were all so isolated from each other, the ability to do this kind of conversation that we're doing right now, I think, has made a significant difference. It still isn't the same as being in the same room sharing an experience together, but it's probably better than purely written communication. Now, let me go back in history for just a second because I want to observe that the brief kinds of communications, short email kinds of exchanges, are very different from the kinds of written exchanges that you would have seen in 200 or 300 years ago or even earlier. Because the means of communication was very high latency for any distant parts. So, if you were in Europe trying to communicate with somebody in the New World, it could take weeks for letters to be exchanged. The consequence of that is that people tended to write longer letters and to try to be to communicate as much as possible in those letters because you knew that you weren't going to be there to explain anything, and also that the exchanges would be infrequent. Now that we have these very rapid exchanges, whether it's texting or TikTok or 5-second videos or what have you, we are actually losing some of the quality of thoughtful exchange, thoughtful discourse. And so I wonder whether we need to do something about that in order to improve the quality of the exchange.
What do we do?
Well, one possibility, of course, is that meeting face to face tends to force you into an extended dialogue, like the one that we're having right now. And it's the necessities of extended dialogue are really important. One of the things that I learned from Sherry Turkle, who's an MIT professor who's written a number of books, one of which was called Alone Together. She was describing teenagers with their mobiles sitting around the table or in a shopping mall, not even talking to each other, but texting on their mobiles with somebody else who wasn't part of the crowd. and hence the alone together rubric. What she was getting at, though, is that these kids were finding that texting had the property that if you didn't respond, it was okay. Whereas if you were in a telephone conversation or a conversation like this one, if you asked me a question and I didn't know what to say, so I didn't respond, the awkwardness of that silence is notable. And the teenagers who were using texting took advantage of the fact that they could avoid the awkwardness because they were excused from not responding, because it was understood that in texting conditions, you might not be able to respond because you got distracted or some other more important thing happened. And so you could escape the awkwardness of silence. Whereas so the kids don't talk to each other on the phone
Hmm.
anymore. It's because they don't know what to do when they encounter a moment of awkwardness.